I am beginning to suffer from a visual impairment, which I hope is only physiological vision and not cognitive vision yet. I was only asked to fill in for a plenary speaker 2 weeks ago. Usually with a talk of this length, I spend 2 months organizing it in my head before I put things down the first time. I'll apologize in advance for what will probably be a bumpy flow of ideas. I think the individual ideas are good. I think they fit together in a whole. I don't think I have them well organized yet. I've spent almost 35 years working within a government institution, maybe half of it in a very classical fisheries scientist framework, the second half very much on the science policy interface. And given that I'm supposed to talk about institutions and processes, I'm going to give a very personal perspective on what I've seen happen in those 35 years as the institutions and processes involved in fisheries have tried to respond to a bunch of challenges, including adding the human dimension to it, and adding a biodiversity dimension to what used to be a fisheries world. Now, if I'm talking about institutions and processes, they exist in order to deliver governance. And if we want to understand institutions and processes, we have to understand what it is we want the governance to do. And these are my 3 thoughts on what we want the governance process to have achieved if it's working successfully. Getting the information to support decision making, getting the sectors of society who feel they have an interest in the decision or will be affected by the decision, whether they're aware of it at the time or not, involved in the processes, and then actually getting a decision made and implemented. Now, there was a time when fisheries decision-making was pretty straightforward. There were a bunch of questions about the stock or stocks being harvested. Yeah. What is it we're going to go fish? How much to take? Where and when to take it? All those kinds of things. But at least a quarter century ago, we began to ask a bunch of ecosystem-related questions in the process of making fisheries management decisions as well. About, in the process of fishing, are there parts of the ecosystem that need to be protected from the consequences of the fishing? Whether it's gear-related impacts or just changing the relative abundance of species in the ocean or sizes of fish in the ocean through harvesting them in differential rates. And that led to a real proliferation of challenges to the institutions and processes of making fisheries management decisions to deal with all these other ecosystem properties that would be affected by a decision they made. And then, of course, the other part of the reason for this particular symposium is the fact that we've introduced a bunch of people-related questions. And these are not new questions in any sense. But to make them formal questions that are part of the governance process of a fishery, that is a really new activity. Who is it that we're going to allow to participate? What kinds of opportunities can be distributed among the privilege of giving access to fishing? And if we either deny some groups access or remove access over time because we feel there's too much participation, what happens to those people? They don't just cease to exist, and it's part of the fishery decision, explicit or implicit to take that into account. And then, as we heard extremely articulately in the talk this morning, there's a whole bunch of integrated management questions that are now really becoming part of the fisheries decision-making process that the institutions and the processes have to take into account. Both how the prosecution of a fishery changes the opportunities of other industries to also operate, or how the activities of other industries change the opportunities for fisheries. Now, all these questions have always been part of a fisheries decision. But for a long time, many of them were not explicitly acknowledged as part of the decision-making process. And it took institutions and processes time to realize they were part of the decision-making process, and only after you realize these decisions are being made can you then adapt the institutions and processes to try to make them wisely and justly. And even now, we're struggling with the fact that we tend to compartmentalize the types of decisions in ways that, even though the consequences of making these different decisions are in no way independent of each other, the processes and institutions that make them are a long way from harmonized treatment of questions whose consequences are inextricably interrelated to each other. Note the point on the bottom. I'm almost not going to mention scale in this talk. Scale's crucially important to all these institutions and processes, because different kinds of processes and different kinds of institutions work well at different scales. And if I tried to treat that as well, I would be superficial and cavalier about even more things than I'm already going to be. It's a topic for another symposium, not a quarter of this talk. Now, the approach I'm taking deals with the obvious fact that in order to make a decision wisely and justly, you have to have the relevant information to inform the decision making. The inputs to it about what are the dynamics of the process, about which you're making a decision, what will be the consequences of different options available to you. And there has been a tendency, and I say this having been very deeply involved in the science advisory processes, to local, regional, national, international, and global ocean decision-making processes. There's a real tendency of experts to try to incrementally expand their ability to provide information as the institutions and processes in which they participate as the lead advisors expand the scope of the questions they ask. This has some consequences that I will talk about later in the talk, but keep in mind it's motivated by the best of intentions. The experts want to be useful. The institutions and the processes are acknowledging the context is changing. So there's a natural tendency to simply expand more and more and more what you think you know and what you think your institution can do. What this has meant is that we see a real clash in cultures, a clash in methodologies applied, and a clash in the practices that input information and then use the information in decision making in almost every single aspect of managing fisheries now. And this is not a class of cultures of different stakeholders in competition. This is even a class and culture among the expert communities. Very quickly, I'll just run through about 4 slides on reminding people what the core questions in these different parts of fisheries decision-making were. The stock-related questions about what, where, when, why, how to fish. The ecosystem-related questions, what to protect, how to protect it, how to take account of the footprint of fisheries on the ecosystem in fisheries management decision-making, how to take account of the impact of other industries on the opportunities to fish. And a lot of you are familiar with things like the mitigation hierarchy, which evolved from this, avoid being the gold standard for ecosystem impacts, mitigate, minimize, all these kinds of things. And if all the things in the mitigation hierarchy fail, the obligation to restore or remediate your harmful effects. The participation-related questions aren't quite as easy to lay out. This is my effort at doing so, and I don't blame any reference source for this. There was a time when it was even a question, who even wants to participate in a fishery? Are they participating because it's the employment of last resort, or are they motivated by cultures, traditions, or economic incentives? All those affect the answer to that question. And what's the carrying capacity for fishers? And in no sense is that a fixed answer. It's very dependent on technology and scale. Given that decisions have to be made about who can and can't participate in a fishery, on what basis should that decision be made? Is it history of involvement and culture? Is it opportunity or past investment? These are questions that don't necessarily have the same answer. Is it you get access or deserve access because you can produce the most economic benefit from the use of the resource? Or is it that you can produce the greatest increment in social well-being and livelihoods? And again, these may not produce the same answer. Particularly, they may produce different answers on different scales. These are questions that have to be made explicitly, and institutions and processes really avoided confronting these for many, many years to have the type of dialogue needed to lead to wise and just decisions. And then there's the social and economic integration, the integrated management questions that some of the speakers this morning talked about. And you can see these listed up here just as well as I can. And again, the decision that has to be made somewhere, and if it's not made explicitly, it's still being made implicitly by how viable the different industries are at sharing an ocean that they have not discussed how they will share, how to allocate the opportunities among the different industries that need to share the ocean, and again, a question possibly with very different answers and certainly very different consequences on different scales. And you may make a wise decision on one scale that turns out to play out as a very poor decision on other scales. What's the institution? What's the process where this dialogue appropriately goes on? I'm going to try to tackle that question. And I'm going to separate, for several reasons, the institutions and processes that provide the information to the decision makers from the institutions and processes that use the information in making a decision. I do this partly from personal experience, but partly because they are, for very good reasons, separate institutions and processes. They should be, and they can and have evolved at different rates and in response to different drivers. And it makes sense for several reasons to start with the information provision institutions and processes first, and then look at the evolution of these institutions and how the decision-making processes in particular, just as the information provision institutions, it's not news to anyone in this room that new types of research are partly a learning by doing experience. We learn how to collect the right information, present it in the right ways, only by trying multiple efforts and finding out what works best. We're not that forgiving about the decision-making processes. They also have to learn how to use the information in making good decisions. Now, in terms of provision of information for the classic single-species questions, and as they evolved into the multi-species questions, the science advisory processes in Canada, I know the NOAA process very well, I know the MSEAS process intimately. We develop processes and standards for how the information collection and the provision of scientific and technical advice worked. And we learned by experience. The value of peer review, the value of a second tier of that review. How to validate all our methodology, how to replicate, even to the point where there are standards for the tables and figures we produce, so that the decision-making process is well served by the science advice. This has made it a very, very strongly expert-driven process. And that expert-driven process has had some challenges thrown at it to which it's had to adapt. Challenges like a structured precautionary approach. I can tell you from firsthand experience being on the MSEAS advisory for fisheries management when the PA was adopted. That really changed and challenged the process of providing fisheries advice. Harvest control rules the same. But the consequence of those challenges is even more rule-based, expert-driven process to produce the results. Working with my colleagues in fish management, I've had some exposure to how they've dealt historically with the participation, the licensing questions. Licensing is the Canadian way of managing it. And this was much more seat of the pants. Not that it wasn't expert-driven, but it was not algorithmically and data-driven in the same way. The issue of the carrying capacity, how many to let in, sometimes was handled algorithmically, quantitatively, as if there was some numerical answer to the right number of fishers to allow, but rarely. By the time we get to the question of, given we've made some kind of decision about what to allow in participation, who gets the opportunity? That was never an expert-driven process. That was acknowledged to be a societal choice. There is no analytically right answer to who to let into the fishery. A society should choose. The response of most governments that try to manage that, though, has been very strongly top-down. The government will decide. It is the elected representative of the people, and it will make the decision for the people. There's been social science engagement in trying to advise the decision makers about the outcomes of different decisions about who to let in. So it's not that it has been a process lacking in expert input, but it hasn't been an expert-driven process in the way that the fish decisions and the ecosystem decisions were expert-driven. And I think most social scientists will agree with me, they've struggled to get access to the decision-making process. They haven't had the decision-making process beat a path to their door to get that information. The ecosystem questions were interesting to the information provision institutions and processes. It was still interpreted as an expert-driven process. For ICES, it started off in about 1980 or 82 with creating the Working Group on Ecosystem Effects of Fishing. WGECO was one of the first structured process forays into providing the knowledge needed to inform the ecosystem scale questions of fisheries. And it brought with it a very new mixture of types of experts to work together. The advisory institutions, and again I'm using ICES as an example because it's so easy to be explicit about the ICES processes and institutions. Initially, ACFM, the Advisory Committee on Fisheries Management, simply assumed that the ecosystem questions could be addressed by fiddling the appropriate fishing mortality to apply to the stocks involved. But as the questions from the decision-making clients proliferated and diversified, the question of what is changing in the ecosystem because we're fishing it got more and more sophisticated, more and more complex, and the Advisory Committee on the Marine Environment, which had been created for what reason? Who remembers why ACME was created? To deal with pollution, contaminants, and eutrophication, started having to answer questions about how the ecosystem was being affected by fishing. So two different parts of ICES were being asked to advise on two different aspects of the process, the consequences of fishing. And then a whole bunch of questions when the Habitats Directive, the Species Directive, and Natura 2000 looked at the marine environment for the first time about what actually protect couldn't be handled very well by either of those groups. So what do you do when you've got a gap? You create a third process to fill the gap. They created the Advisory Committee on Marine Environment, Marine Ecosystems, to answer those questions. So now you've got three different processes within ICES, all responding to different aspects of the question, how is the fishery affecting the ecosystem? It didn't work, but it was an attempt to keep everything within an expert-driven, rule-based, structured advisory process. So we get this evolution here from back in the 1920s. And I say this having read as part of a project I do with Howard Brauman, the early ICES committee reports, there was no structure for how fisheries information was provided to fisheries managers. You just took what information was provided by the committee, packaged it in a way the committee felt made sense, and produced a committee report for nations to use as they saw fit or not. As the structure to request fish stock advice became more organized by the decision-making process of the European countries in particular, there actually became structured fish stock advice. Whoops. And it set up standards for assessments, for monitoring, and all these kinds of things characterized ACFM or its predecessors from the 50s right through until the early 80s. By the early 80s, ecosystem information was coming into the fisheries processes. They didn't know what to do with it, but they were getting it, and it became a narrative paragraph or two before you read the real advice. When ICES began to get serious conservation questions from the Species Directive, the Habitats Directive, the Natura 2000 sites, that's when it began to present conservation advice. And the environmental information that the ACFM didn't know what to do with, the conservation community was quite willing to give advice on questions which had big consequences for fisheries just based on the environmental information. And they gave it to different ministries. And let's talk for a minute about how those ministries themselves evolved. Now that we've seen how the information processing institutions and processes have tried to evolve to keep up with the expanding need. The target species decisions started off, government fish management and policy groups made them on the basis of expert advice. As more and more parts of the ecosystem were directly exploited, you got more and more of these decisions being made. They weren't even harmonized within the management and policy institutions, certainly not in the expert processes advising them. That led to a set of legislation in the US, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, national standards. The decision processes were obligated to produce certain outcomes to show that they met national standards. In Canada, things like the application of the precautionary approach. We had a working group of 14 departments of government, all of whom were trying to implement the precautionary approach in their business, agree on a set of standards that all departments had to use in application of precaution, however it was being applied. So the goal of these efforts by the decision-making institutions and the governments that were trying to make top-down decisions on these issues were, let's keep it an expert-driven process, and let's just make more diversified rules to deal with the increasingly diversified class of questions. Now, that didn't work at all well in the long run because of the challenges of the participation decisions. The information provision to the participation decisions was never as expert dominated to begin with. And as these same institutions that made the decisions, the fisheries departments or their equivalents, across all your countries. DG Mare, DG Fish before DG Mare operated. Their top-down approach was challenged much earlier, and they were much more vulnerable to the challenges, that there had to be some bottom-up inclusiveness to the processes that not just provided the information, but actually made the decisions. How these processes evolved is really dependent on what country and often what region within the country, speaking from a country as big as Canada, with great regional differences. These evolved very differently in the decision-making processes, even within one country, because of the differences among regions in how wealth and power was controlled by the fishery, controlled by large-scale fisheries, controlled by small-scale community-based fisheries, or controlled by completely other sectors using the same ocean. And this led to all the decision processes becoming really highly politicized by the 80s, the 90s, and even into the 2000s. Part of the politicization meant that different interest groups began to bring their own experts to back them up in the decision-making processes, where you didn't have a structured single process for getting the science advice. Everybody brought different science advice to the table. And the science advice they brought was completely nested within the value system of the interest group providing expert input to these decision-making processes. In a system that was becoming dysfunctional because it couldn't deal with the participation decisions when tough decisions had to be made, it was confronted starting in the 80s and really amplifying in the 90s and the 2000s, a bunch of ecosystem decisions that the fisheries departments felt they could make on their own. Now, all the people who were interested in these ecosystem questions wanted them knowledge-based. But they also wanted them made by the institution and in the process in which they were already nested and felt they could have the most meaningful influence over the decision. What that led fisheries to do was say, we know how to make decisions based on expert input. We want the expert input to just include more and more ecosystem factors in the knowledge they're giving us. And that led to a variety of attempts to make our stock assessment models multi-species models, have lots of environmental terms, proliferate the number of things put in the model, just so we could say, oh, well, so the decision makers could say, the ecosystem's being taken into account because it's part of the model and it's in the expert advice that we're used to getting and we know how to use in decision making. The conservation biology community, who traditionally had little or no access to the fisheries decision-making processes, at least in any meaningful scale, weren't the least bit satisfied with the ecosystem scale questions being handled in that way. They had their own institutions and processes in which they had well-connected roles to the decision makers and a good understanding of how to package the ecosystem information in ways that this completely different group of environmental decision makers could understand and use in their decision making. What this has led to, and we still face it today, is a battle of decision-making processes between fisheries and environmental ministries with dueling experts, preferred or less preferred by each one. This reached a particular level of absurdity when both the ICES Advisory Committee on Fish Management and Advisory Committee on Ecosystem, on the marine environment, received requests, one from DG Fish, one from DG Environment, about whether to protect Haddon Bank from the impacts of fishing gears, and if so, how. And if it weren't for the fact that one person was going to both of them as chair of a consultative committee, no part of ICES would even have known that they were providing different advice, and it was quite different advice, to two different decision-making bodies about the same threat to the same ecosystem feature. And this was only 10 years ago. It led to a restructuring of the ICES advisory process. So this type of thing is much less likely to happen. But it really underscored how independent these pathways have been and how each has tried, with the best of intentions, to deal with making the right decision, using the right information. But right means something different to different interest groups. And yeah. And this is not just a pathology of ICES. I think a couple other people in the room, like me, have been involved in the ongoing debate between CITES and FAO about the information base that's appropriate to use in deciding to whether or not to list a commercially exploited marine species under one of the annexes of CITES. Now, it's not on there, but the fact that we have an FAO process to identify vulnerable marine ecosystems and a CBD process to identify ecologically and biologically significant areas. They use criteria that experts have reviewed 2 or 3 times and consider functionally interchangeable. But the 2 attempts to have one meeting to apply both sets of criteria were total failures. And they can have back-to-back meetings using the same data today and produce 2 different sets of maps, but they can't meet together to present one map using criteria that are identical. I'm going to digress for a minute because one of the slides I took out, but it became really germane after this morning's talks and dialogue. Why is it that we're interpreting scientific and technical information differently? Saying, well, if we put it in a risk management framework, the problem will go away. The problem will not go away in any sense if you put it in a risk-based framework, as long as the different constituencies have different profiles of risk tolerances for the types of decision-making errors that can be made. It's an inescapable fact, and human factors research explores this in depth. If you have uncertain information, and as far as I know, what we know of ecosystems and people has some uncertainty in it, you cannot make an error-free decision. There will be an error rate. And there are two kinds of errors. There are misses. When you did not take, let's say, a conservation measure, when in retrospect, had you done it, a problem would have been avoided. And there can be false alarms. You can intervene, close a fishery, or regulate it in more stringent ways to prevent harm, decreasing the benefits from that industry, and actually achieving no ecological good because the problem was not as serious as you thought. Two different kinds of errors. They distribute the costs and the benefits in completely different ways. And different communities have different tolerances for the risks of over-regulating an industry for no benefit in order to have an ecosystem consequence that really didn't need the regulation, compared to allowing an impact on the ecosystem that in retrospect you wish hadn't happened and you could have prevented. Until all of humanity has the same risk tolerance profile for those two kinds of errors, pretending that a risk management approach will solve the problem is wrong. It will give you a different language to discuss and a different, possibly, decision-making process to come to a conclusion about which of those errors to tolerate. But it will not make the problem itself go away.
10 minutes, Jake.
Thank you. Now, the institutions did try to adapt. At the expert level, we changed the advisory position. We created working groups within ICs. We developed management strategy evaluations, pretending that we could simulate away the challenges that we faced. The decision-making level really increased the serious effort at creating consultative bodies. And there were lots of commitments, some driven by judicial decisions, some voluntary, for co-management, even though there's no disciplinary consensus on what co-management actually means. Now, the conclusion I came to in the week and a half I've had to think about these challenges since I was asked to put the talk together is that the size and the insistency of these demands for change has exceeded our institutional capacity in several important ways, and it will continue to make it worse. The conservation participation has increased the breadth of what scientific information has to be available and what risks have to be considered. The economists and the social scientists have brought much more information to the decision-making processes about what kinds of benefits and what kinds of disbenefits will accrue to different interest groups, different sectors of society, from the alternatives on the table. And the inclusiveness of participation by stakeholders, including not just fishery participants, but indigenous peoples, local communities and stuff, have brought more participation in the decision-making process. But it hasn't made the process simpler. We're finding the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, some of the outputs it's producing are fundamentally challenging where we need to go in fisheries management decision-making. The CBD, the Aichi biodiversity targets, the Sustainable Development Goals, they're changing the landscape of outcomes that our countries have signed up to deliver. Not to talk about, but to deliver. And the diversification of legitimate knowledge systems is being brought into the dialogue through the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. even expert-driven processes, now have to acknowledge that there are multiple knowledge systems which can produce experts. Science, we know. Indigenous cultures have a deep knowledge of the systems in which they live. Local communities, the Newfoundland fishermen who have fished there for hundreds of years, have a knowledge of those systems that is relevant. So I see three fundamental changes that we've made in response to these challenges, which collectively have not positioned us well enough to deal with the realities we face today. We've gone from top-down management for large-scale fisheries or a benign neglect, neither benign nor neglectful, but in governance models treated that way, of small-scale artisanal fisheries, to a greater diversification of participation and rules of engagement. We have tried to consider explicitly in the fisheries management decision-making and the information provided to the decision-makers a much greater diversity of information. About social and economic consequences, we are trying to make them aware of the consequences. We're trying to get better information in more meaningful decision-making settings about a broad range of ecosystem consequences of fishing and the interactions of fisheries with other sectors. But the intersectoral challenge that I just mentioned is the one that I think will show how ill-equipped the institutions and processes we have for fisheries management are to deal with the point we've reached in the 21st century. Fisheries management is being directly affected by a whole bunch of decisions and processes that are being made elsewhere than ones where fisheries management is the identified task of the organization, whether it's an information provision institution or a decision-making institution. It was foreshadowed, for those of you from Europe, by the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And as best I know, and I've been involved in it on and off since the directive was adopted, a lot of organizations within the EU are really struggling with the dual economic and environmental agendas that don't harmonize within industries and harmonize even more poorly across industries. Globally, it's coming out even stronger as the IPCC deals more serious with the ocean, the CBD, the Sustainable Development Goals present ocean-based outcomes that fisheries play a role in, but fisheries did not dominate the decision-making process about the targets for the CBD or the development goals in any sense. And the UN Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement is going to bring this home even more strongly. So what we have now is we still have fishery decisions and environmental decisions being made separately by separate institutions and processes. But they're not independent in their outcome, they're not independent in the advice that's going in, and we have a bunch of other industry sectors that are more and more overlapping in their outcomes, intended or not, with fisheries decisions and environmental decisions. We have lots of advisory processes of varying strengths and meaningfulness on various scales, and they're putting into all of them. And we have other science sectors than ones we traditionally thought belonged to fisheries. either socially or biologically, being meaningfully included in all of these processes. So let's consider what this means for the adaptation, for the integration. What kind of properties do we need in our institutions and processes now if we're going to make wise decisions about the oceans and the fisheries within it? And how can we get there?
So 2 minutes, Jake.
Thank you. Other industries have their own experts. We need to share information more meaningfully across industries. And there are some successes, but many misunderstandings, because the information's used in different ways, risks are assessed in different ways, and they don't stay expert processes very long before they become part of the political process. The policy outcomes, we should learn from the species at risk experience, from the EBSA VME experience, how we need to adapt the conservation and usage processes to be more mutually accommodating, because both policy making processes claim to be science and knowledge based and not using it. And let's see. The social sciences clearly have an important role in all this. And these are only some of the many kinds of contributions the social science community can make to this new governance model. They have to have a meaningful place in it. And we have to depoliticize the decision-making process. And the reasons why our efforts to do so far with things like management strategy evaluation haven't worked is both because they're weak in practice and they're fundamentally the wrong way to think about the problem we have to solve. We need institutions that are participatory. Nobody disagrees with that. But they have to have a common understanding of what an equitable outcome of the decision will be. Priorities for history and culture, for investment, for economics, and social need. We have no forum to discuss what role those four factors have in deciding a decision is equitable and just. And no institution that has a historical affiliation with any one sector will be able to adapt in a way that will be perceived as equitable by all the others. The UN Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction process took 6 years to agree that a new instrument was even needed. The PrepCom is budgeted for 3 years to set the parameters on what the new instrument will even address. 3 years to agree on what it has to agree on. And we need time to get out of these molds of governance. And I think this is, yeah. We need a consensus process that gives the interest groups allowed to participate. Well, if we have a consensus process, you give everybody a veto power. That's dysfunctional governance. And it leads to, and I say this from tons of firsthand experience, you get consensus on a decision so vague that everybody in the room who came with different goals leaves thinking their goals are accommodated by the vague consensus. So you've achieved nothing. And the other effective area-based management measures in IG Target 11 highlight that in spades. Majority processes, they simply lead to those with power using a majority process to keep power. And we need better knowledge provision, more recognition of multiple knowledge systems. I'll talk about that in my talk on Thursday. And we need processes for synthesizing knowledge across systems. And they might be the best help. Because each knowledge system has different strengths, and possibly the synthesis of the different knowledge systems may give us the answer to what we need in a new generation of institutions and processes that can deal with globalization of economics, hunger and food security, climate change, and all the other challenges that are now part of fisheries management decision-making, whether we like them or not. So break out of the mindsets that we've had for a while already, mindsets that we can model ourselves out of any problem, the mindset that everything is trade-offable. Human rights are not subject matter for trade-offs. Human rights are not subject matter for economic valuation. Human rights are tied up in every decision that affects livelihoods. And we need to acknowledge that and get our processes to have that be part of our decision-making process. So with that, I am done. Thank you.